Hi, everybody. Hello, hello. Okay, so I'm here to introduce this concept that I've been working on since I left Maker, and it's the idea of moving from a closed organization to an open network, aka progressive decentralization 2.0. It is a lot of research, like since last year, so it's a lot of text. I'm gonna go fast. Please stop me after the talk. I'm more excited to talk to everyone individually, so don't feel like so rushed. Okay, so I'm Amy. I used to be the head of community development at MakerDAO, and a lot of the work I focused on was the transition of the dissolution of the foundation into sort of the full MakerDAO that kind of is today. And my background's in tech and design. I want to go back. I left these QR codes on the right-hand corner that references any text or kind of like readings. So feel free, if you can't scan them now, just feel free to just give me a ping. So I wanted to just start with the idea of the focus that I'm on, because when I first left Maker, I really wanted to think about a DAO playbook, and this was last year before it was like really the height of DAOs. But I realized I didn't want to create anything too prescriptive. And so I wanted to focus on something that I knew I'm familiar with, which is this transition process. Because when you're making this transition process from sort of like a centralized or a simple kind of company to a larger or to like an open network, what happens is you make decisions on those like, hey, I want to be centralized here, I don't want to be centralized here, and that starts to capture a little bit about like what makes DAOs unique, what kind of decisions are you making there. And so I just focus specifically on this transition piece, as well as I start to think about DAOs in this context of like an open network or an internet native organization, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then ultimately, I like to build. I just want something super practical that is easy for people to use and pick up, and so this is more builders by builders. It is, again, a lot of information that I'm about to share to you. I didn't have time to edit it, so feel free to like stop me and we'll have a conversation after. So this research, which I also want to appreciate Smart Contract Research Forum for funding a lot of some of this grant as well. It comes in 3 pieces. As I said, it's a lot, so I'm going to cut down quite significantly, but it talks a little bit about the first part, which I believe when you're kind of thinking about building in the space, you have to think about the paradigm of what you're trying to do in a kind of a different mindset than you would in, quote, Web 2. And then the second one's going to be around what's decentralization and my views on how you should think about decentralization and what I call multi-party ownership. This could also be community ownership. And then the last one's going to be like literally step by step what happens in this progressive decentralization. And so this is something that I think a lot of people are going to be familiar with when we start to think about industrial revolution and how that was focused so much on streamlining things. A lot of it is about information and resource efficiency, right? So a good example I like to give is autonomous cars. You have Google, you have Amazon, everyone's building their own autonomous cars, but they're doing it in a way that's highly competitive, and that in itself, that silo, is actually what's driving the innovation in itself. When we think about what we want to do today and how crypto works and how it's grown today, it's actually more about maximizing the coordination. So because the data and information is so readily available to everybody, it's really about the coordination of organized individuals that we start to see. So Wikipedia is even a good example that's non-crypto, where you see how you create a process to kind of share and understand how to build resources. And so just a quick summary of open networks and how I think about them. There's a lot of internet native behavior. So there's a lot of kind of how information spreads like wildfire, how DAOs have been able to grow really rapidly, and this idea of autonomous execution that's pretty unique to the environment that we have today. And then this readily information allows you to have a lot of peer-to-peer self-organization and how you can regulate through these peer-to-peer systems. And then the last one I'll talk a little bit more about is multi-party ownership. So this is, when I was thinking about working with some teams and asking themselves, like, why are you trying to do this decentralization process? Everyone's like, I want to do it. And I've kind of summarized in a few slides some reasons that I've seen. So the first one is that value is just ultimately larger at this scale. So an example, again, is Wikipedia, where sure, one person can write an encyclopedia, but guess what? If everyone contributes and there's a process for it, you can actually get a much more valuable kind of output. And then the second one is obviously the strategies in DeFi that you see, the contributions of different teams and kind of creating these systems allow us to have value at a larger scale. And then this is one that I see most commonly, which is the famous Uniswap and Sushi. There's a lot of fear that drives a lot of the market share. So we want to. So a lot of teams want to go on the offensive or the defensive of trying to protect their moat of something that they've built. Another famous one is this exit to community. I think there's actually two reasons. I think Nathan Schneider has worked a lot on this concept, and I highly recommend learning a little bit more about it. But more importantly, I think with exit to community, we also see founders getting really burnt out, just the reality of things, and they're ready to kind of let go a lot of that ownership, as well as obviously regulatory compliance. So a lot of people are scared to get served, and so they really want to reduce dependency on the founding team. So a lot of teams have one or more of these. I don't think that it's exclusive. Maybe your legal team is worried about one more than the other, and that's okay. But at least you guys can start having a conversation about why you're decentralizing, what's the catalyst for that process, and then to have a conversation around, okay, well, what's our strategy to move forward? This is a really big one that I will talk about. Decentralization doesn't have to be binary. I think the face that I get everyone who's excited about decentralization is also fear. So I want to say, like, there's so many ways you could make decisions and govern something in such a different level. And so you have to think about, what are you decentralizing? What piece of the stack are you decentralizing? Is it the protocol level? Is it a organizational level? There's so many different ways that you can think about it, and it gets overwhelming, I understand, but at the same time, that nuance is so important because it's going to come out in the process that you are decentralizing. So ultimately, you really want to think about, like, why you want to do this, and then how you want to share ownership with your community or your other stakeholders, and then how that process is going to look like, really. This is a really great example I love to give around Nadia, who's like an incredible researcher, writer. She talks about, in open source, there's this idea of contributors and users. And it's really more about the ratio. So this idea that you could, a federation, for example, you have a high number of contributors or people who are helping build something, as well as a lot of users who are kind of utilizing the service or the product. And I think when we think about Ethereum at large, there's so many people building on it, and there's so many, specific kind of solutions, but at the same time, so many people are using it. And so this idea of this compared to the stadium model, which I would say a lot of products and teams are today. A stadium is what you imagine me standing on stage trying to tell you something, a group of people where the audience is larger. And so the Geth team, for example, it's a very small group of core developers, but then so many teams rely on this library and this kind of like client. And so the idea of a lot of teams may want to go from a stadium, which is a smaller team, to something larger like a federation. And so when you're doing this transition, you can also go from a very super small hackathon project to a stadium, to a federation. So we start to see a lot of this like movement. And so when we think about this, we think about multi-party ownership. And ultimately, why do DAOs come together? They just want to do something, right? That is just like the basic idea. They want to do something. But the way that you can build something is, there's so many different models you could look at. You could look at a team that's just doing something by themselves. There's teams that have multi like orgs. So I might be a company, a incorporated company, and then there's a DAO that's running parallel. You can also just have only a DAO, which is just membership by token, or any of the membership models that you might have. And then I think what's coming really popular is this idea of sub-DAOs. And so I did a little bit of research around like what happens when you have just like multi-party organizations, and MakerDAO is kind of the biggest example, I would say, of going from just like a sole team to really like a multi-party org where so many team members have different dependencies on each other, but everyone is kind of an equal builder in something. I Something that I'm less familiar with, but I think is really interesting, are just like crypto native organizations. So what happens when they start crypto native first, and then the processes and tools that are used in that aspect. And then even like when teams are transitioning from a closed organization to an open organization, what happens, like funding is a really interesting model where maybe a lot of teams have been private institutional funding in the beginning and then moving into more of a token airdrop and then a treasury, and then they're kind of growing and growing and growing. And so this is the final kind of step-by-step that I will share that I saw. If we take Jesse Walden's like very famous progressive decentralization concept, the three main pieces are product market fit, community participation, and then sufficient decentralization. But from sort of the experience I had at Maker, I actually noticed that there's a longer tailwind. There's an entire journey in this step. And so the first step of bootstrapping is this idea of the core team. I think everyone's pretty familiar with this. The main purpose of this is product market fit. And so all the teams are just iterating and working really hard to get to this stage. And so you'll see that like the initial team of anything, people are just trying to prove that there's such an important purpose to whatever they are building that everyone feels like this is the most valuable thing and need to maintain it. And a few like indicators is obviously there's sort of a closed admin system in the beginning. And then this is what I believe is the most important piece that a lot of people skip through. Peter, who spoke earlier today, he and I have really great conversations about the importance of long-term community building. And it's because when you're thinking about giving a network to somebody, you don't just say, hey, by the way, here's the keys to the car, like now you're the owner. You really have to build the ownership through time and understand how people understand responsibilities. And so this part is super important because you're looking for those people who are going to start to think about long-term and ownership. And so a lot of it right now, I think at this stage when you're starting early, there's a lot of resources in this area. But essentially, you kind of just like one-way facing, like here's information, come on in. And so you see a lot of grants programs, hackathons, translations. You're trying to get more community members involved. And I'm going to go through some examples quickly because I have a little time left. And then the third one is transition. And I think there's so much here that I see a lot of teams going through today. And the big part of transition is that you're kind of looking for long-term maintenance of the protocol or the project or any of these aspects. So you're thinking about operations of how can this exist long-term. And a lot of it is like, you really only need like 100 true fans because these are the people who are then gonna like bootstrap you to the next phase of like being a fully decentralized organization. And so a lot of it is just like, you start to see a lot of more proactive contributors, and then you're thinking about how do you support those proactive contributors. A lot of things that I would say indicators and like what you can do is like you can create community handbooks. You can a lot of things that happen in this stage is that people start to create newsletters because there's so much happening in this organization. And then you start to think about how core teams that have built in the beginning, they focus a lot on knowledge sharing. And instead of them creating something, they're thinking about how to scale their previous work into more contributors. And luckily, there's so much that has been being developed now, especially with tooling, with different incentive, liquidity incentive models. So there's a lot that's still in action. And then the last stage is autonomy, or the second to last stage is autonomy, where it's really focused on mitigating once that platform risk of like, okay, without the core team, it's still good. And so this idea of community and owned operated is really when not one single entity has asymmetric information. So it takes a whole group of people to coordinate. And I think in this space, a lot of it is just about coordination. I think I see this a lot in DAOs that have like just turned into, that have just launched a token, for example. And they're really thinking about how to coordinate best among these different owners and stakeholders. So it gets a lot more. Maker has done a lot of work on this, including like transparent reporting, delegate frameworks, and how do we actually govern like community-owned assets. And the last one, scale. I would say there's a lot that I'm excited. When I first started this research last year, there was really not too much. And now we're seeing a lot of DAO to DAO kind of interaction. So I'm excited to like revise this and refill that in. But a lot of it is just around DAOs, working with other DAOs and how to, it's like in the new phase of improving its own system that's not set up by the founding team. So ultimately, there's a lot of kind of like pitfalls for sure. I think there's a lot of like trying to avoid decentralization theater. The big one is trying to, once you launch a token, how do you make sure you don't have just speculators and you actually have owners? And I'm working on some research about filling all the different challenges in this entire stage. So if you're really excited about this or you want to learn more, you're a project, you're a researcher, I am looking for some people to help me work on this and update essentially a lot of the work that has been started from last year. So thank you.
Hi, we have time for questions, so if you have any questions, please raise your hands and we'll pass this box along. You have a question. Catch it.
Thanks for being the brave question.
No, thank you. This is such a great presentation and research. And we are, I'm from Grow Protocol, and we are going through exactly similar thoughts around how to decentralize. One question I have is, you lay it out as 5 steps. Do you feel that those are oftentimes the pitfalls being trying to skip through some steps? And if people have already done that, have already tried to run before they can walk, how could they go back? How do they actually go back to the right steps so then they can actually build with a solid foundation?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to put Gitcoin here at, I did give an example of when there was the idea of Akita tokens, and before the community had ever had a chance to work together, it had to resolve this really, really, really big problem, right? And so I think the stewards did a really good job of regrouping and trying to figure out, okay, what is the best win-win situation in which everyone could win? And sometimes it is just taking that step back and saying, okay, we actually need more people who have ownership. We need people who are talking to the other team and so on. And so this framework, sure, it's 5 steps, step by step, but I've seen teams go through it super, super fast, through some of the steps, and it's okay. It's just take the step back. Just understand that these are different phases. There's so many iterations of this, That's why it's just for me to, I think this whole thing is about people who just want to see the big picture. And then they can say, oh, okay, we can go backwards. And I also want to do a lot more research on some of the challenges. Yeah.
I guess we're running out of time, so you can maybe catch her outside and ask more questions. Thank you, Amy, for the great talk.